This introduction, I'm going to talk about what makes this course different from other memory courses out there. Because if you're interested in memory, this probably isn't the first course, first book, first blog post article that you've read on memory. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there. These memory skills have been rediscovered, in a sense, in the last few decades when they've really gained popularity. There's just a few years ago, world memory championships gained a lot of attention, where before they either didn't exist or they were very low profile. So memory is becoming very popular, and it's only going to become more popular in the coming years. But the problem is it's still the public's understanding is very unsophisticated. So there's a lot of ideas out there that are being peddled around that aren't necessarily true. So a lot of this course at the beginning stage is going to be demystifying what memory is, how it actually works, and why some of the things that are out there that other people are teaching aren't accurate or aren't useful for the type of learning that you want to do. And this was one of the biggest frustrations I had when I started getting into memory. I'll talk about that more in the next video, my story, how I got interested in memory and my journey. But in this introduction, I'm going to first talk about setting some expectations, because one of the things that people look for when they're looking for a memory system is, well, I want the easiest method. I want the easiest way to memorize stuff. And the problem is the easiest way to memorize things isn't necessarily the most effective. So it's not necessarily the most long-term oriented, meaning you want to retain things long-term. Anybody can remember something for a minute, for an hour, for a few days, but it's having access to that for the coming years, for the rest of your life, that's difficult. And another thing is that people think that memorization is mostly about the repetition. What they don't understand is that you need to encode memories in new ways to take advantage of how your memory has evolved, how human memory has evolved over time. And the primary method is using visual mnemonics. And visual mnemonics takes advantage of the fact that we can remember spatial orientation, anything spatial very easily. So that means if you walk into a room, you can remember what's in that room. And it's not something that you have to intentionally do. And that's because as a hunter-gatherer species, but also just our lineage of animals that need to be able to navigate, it built this part of our brain. And so the trick is, well, how do you use that in order to store information? So that's what we're going to be learning more about. And the trick isn't just getting the repetitions, but it's how do you turn information into something that can be stored spatially. So that's why I mean here by learning a new language. The other thing is that memory isn't a solution for everything. So one part of it is you may not need to memorize everything. So people think, well, right now I don't remember anything. Maybe I should go for something where I can memorize a book, or I can remember everything, or I'll memorize it subconsciously or whatever. But here's the thing, memory isn't the solution a lot of times. Sometimes, even if you memorize it, you need to teach other people, or you need to delegate to other people. Or it's a trade-off between how long, eventually, even though you may not know right now how long it takes for you to memorize something, eventually you're going to get to the point where you can estimate very accurately how long it's going to take you to memorize something. And then it becomes a question of, you got so amount of time, how are you going to use that time to memorize? What's worth memorizing? What's worth storing? For a lot of you, if you don't have a good system for organizing your information so you can get it back later, it may seem like memorization is the only option. But it turns out a lot of times memorizing something is actually inefficient compared to just putting it away, storing it, and having memorized your storage system. So what that means is you have certain places where you put everything and you've memorized that. So you always know, okay, this is something about this subject, it always goes in this one place. Then you remember you've put everything in that place. It's like if you ever saw the movie Ice Age, the squirrel, he forgets where he put his nut and he can't find it later. So it's not just about, a lot of people with memorizing or with organizing information, it's like they're digging little holes and hiding their nut in there, but then come the winter time when they're trying to find that nut, they can't find it. So it's not just about storing stuff, it's also about having memorized where you put everything. And the ideal way to do that is have a system. Talk about that a little bit in my note-taking course, the one that comes before this one, but I also have a course coming out that goes really deep into how to organize externally on your computer, in your file cabinets, folders, 3-ring binders. But by doing that process, it also adds a huge amount of clarity to your thinking internally. That's why it's really important. The other thing is building systems is building habits. So the system has to come first, because otherwise the habit doesn't make sense. But you have to have habits also for reviewing information. And there's different ways to do that. I'm going to talk about how to schedule things. We'll get more into that later. Next, mistakes. What are some of the common mistakes people make that don't have a memory system right now, don't know how to memorize? Number one, not using spaced repetitions. Spaced repetitions are really important. A lot of people don't realize how important spaced repetition is, because when you finish a book, when you finish a course, you usually feel like you learned a lot, and you feel like you have access to all that information. Turns out that often you don't, and when we're in school and we have tests, it's very easy for us to measure how much we know. But even that is a short-term measurement. It's saying, okay, you knew this amount of information right now, but you may dump 90% of that and then start learning the next material and not retain it. So it's about measuring how much do you know right now, but also how much are you going to know in a week, a month, a year. So spaced repetition is about knowing that you need to do those repetitions and having an efficient way to do it. Next thing is making things memorable. So visual mnemonics, that's one way to do it, but there's some other strategies, so we'll talk about that. No way of determining whether something should be memorized or not. So I talked about this before with, eventually you're going to be able to predict how long something is going to take to memorize. So once you're able to do that, you have to figure out, okay, is this something that I should memorize or not? Or is this something I should store? So eventually you're going to realize that a good amount of what you're learning actually doesn't need to be memorized. It should be stored in a retrieval system. And in reality, your brain is just a retrieval system in terms of your memory. You're just retrieving things from your memory. So it's not really that different from retrieving something from your computer or retrieving things from your filing system, your filing cabinets, 3-ring binders, bookshelf, whatever it is. Turns out the guys who invented Google, their original vision was, I want to be able to think a thought or a question and have a computer directly connected to my brain so that the computer gives me an answer right after I ask the question. That was their vision. That's what inspired Google, that search engine. So Larry Page, Sergey Brin, that's what their original vision was when they were at Stanford. So that's where it all started. And it gives you the idea of, okay, retrieving information, whether it's a memory in my head, whether it's something physically or something digitally in my computer, my phone, whatever. What's important isn't just your ability to memorize things, but know where things are and how long does it take to retrieve that information. And if maybe it's okay for it to take a minute for you to retrieve it out of a 3-ring binder instead of a second in your brain. So you have to know that, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to memorize everything. You feel like you need to memorize everything, you get overwhelmed, you end up not doing anything or getting really stressed out. So got to understand that piece of it. And that brings us to motivation. So how do you motivate yourself? How do you make sure you don't get overwhelmed and actually do it and build the habits? We'll be talking about that also. One of the major things to look out for with other memory courses, other memory experts, is these stage tricks. So things like showing you how to memorize digits of pi, or showing you how to memorize playing cards, or even memorizing names. Memorizing names is a little bit farther on the climb in terms of it is more difficult, but anything that has a set of is a group of things, whether numbers, letters, names, anything that has a limited number of things in that set. Each of those things can be given a symbol, and then those symbols can be memorized. So it's basically like learning a vocabulary of a new language. So if a language only has 20, 30 words in it, then it's not going to be that hard to learn that language. Whereas if the vocabulary is hundreds of thousands of words, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So that's why memorizing random information in terms of numbers or playing cards, you only have a very limited set of maybe 10 digits or 52 cards. It's not that hard to learn that vocabulary. But if you want to memorize something from a book on a subject you know nothing about, it's actually going to be a lot more difficult, even though it seems more manageable. It's just you need to understand how to use those symbols. Another thing is offline spaced repetition. This has been really difficult. I haven't seen anybody else doing any sort of significant work on this, and this is one of the most important things because it's very hard to focus and it's very hard to get repetitions on a lot of material that's not stored in a computer and is not easy to get into a flashcard format. So this is really important also. Realistic look at the time and energy costs, how to make that efficient. You're not going to see that in most other memory courses. And also creating mental infrastructure with mnemonics. So retrieval isn't just about, well, can you retrieve it or not? It's about how easy is it to retrieve when you're in a certain knowledge domain. So if you're talking about one domain and then you have to go into a special memory palace and traverse that palace in order to get the information and figure it out, you're not going to be able to do that a lot of times when you're in the middle of a conversation, when you're thinking about something else. So it turns out that you need to not just have access to it via something like a memory palace or an acronym or something like that, but it actually, that information you're memorizing has to eventually get enmeshed in a neural net, in a network. It has to be like a website on the internet that has a lot of different links going into it, a lot of different links going out of it. That's the only way where it's really going to become part of your knowledge base. So it's about engineering these connections. It's kind of like, let's say you want to build a city. So you want to learn a new skill. That means you want to build a city. You can't just build one road to that city. You have to build a bunch of different roads going in a lot of different directions. That's the only way where you're going to get trade, transportation, people moving in and out of that city. That transportation has to be really efficient. In your brain, what you're building in terms of roads and streets and highways is that neural network, those neurons, the connections between neurons. So that's something that you can do intentionally, but you have to understand the infrastructure and how mnemonics plays into that, because ultimately what you're doing is building that infrastructure. A lot of people are building very inefficient infrastructure in their brain in terms of their neurons. So that's a new metaphor to think about. We'll be using that more in the coming sections.